excited to have Lydia here. We actually have never formally met, but I think we've crossed paths a lot. But I've been following her work off and on, and kind of immersed myself in it the last few days, and just have really just been blown away by not only how interesting and diverse and wide-ranging it is, but also how relevant it is in a very particular way right now. And it might not be so obvious how relevant it is, but I think it is, and she'll probably illuminate that a little bit. I also have been kind of very interested in how Lydia operates. She's a writer. Let me see if I can get all the writer, does research, is a designer, does exhibitions. I mean, has all these different forms of output and production. But does it in a way where everything kind of weaves together. And it doesn't, I don't think that the pattern is repetitive. It's like sometimes a project will become an exhibition, or research will become a paper, or research will become an exhibition. But it's a super fascinating way in which she delves into themes and then ties them together and represents them and presents them, disseminates them in so many different formats. It's really quite amazing. So in broad terms, and this was in the write-up that most of you read, that she described her work as focused on the intersection of architecture, technology, and environmental politics. And that's very concise. I mean, I could elaborate on it, and it would probably mess up the clarity of that, but I think it's a very kind of concise description of her work. One of her more influential projects that really went on for several years is a project called the Architecture of Closed Worlds. And I think she's going to present some of that today. But this was a project that was based on work, I think really she was doing for a long time, even probably going back to her dissertation at Princeton. But just looking at this range of kind of utopian projects that try to essentially replicate or create closed-off environments. The most well-known one, and there's several well-known, Biosphere 2, NASA's Living Pod, I think it's called. But these kind of utopian experiments to try to create these sort of synthetic, hermetically sealed environments that somehow get close to replicating, natural systems, all of which fail. And a lot of them are speculative projects, but a lot of them are also literally functional, very expensive projects that took place. So it's an interesting kind of, that project is an interesting overview of all of these. I think there are 41 or 42 of these projects that were initially started as an exhibition at Storefront. Which I did see that exhibition. It was a phenomenal, very immersive, beautifully designed exhibition in a super small space that presented this incredible range and kind of the complexity of this material. And that kind of evolved. It was very well received, very influential, and evolved into finally into a book called The Architecture of Closed Worlds, which was published in 2018. I think her talk today is going to be on that to an extent, but also involve some other projects. She said she's never given this talk before, which actually I always think is a great thing, because we're going to kind of see new thinking, and it might be some improv going on, which is always great. So just to talk a little bit about her accomplishments, because it's pretty amazing. She's a prolific writer, designer, teacher, as I mentioned. Her work has been exhibited at some of the highest profile venues around the world, including the Venice Biennial, the Istanbul Design Biennial, the Shenzhen Biennial, the Royal Academy of British Architects, and as I mentioned, the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. She's written many articles, again, appearing in some of the most respected journals and magazines around, and then teaching. All of this kind of coincides with her teaching. If you track her teaching, she kind of starts in upstate New York at Syracuse, and then comes south a little bit to RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, comes a little bit further south to Columbia, and currently is further south in southern Manhattan at the Cooper Union. So she recently was appointed assistant professor at Cooper Union. So I'll kind of leave it at that. Just to say that you know, one of our earlier lectures this semester was over in the Living Building, which recently opened with Joe Greco. And I think, even though it might be hard to draw connections between that as a kind of example of a contemporary version, probably not of a closed system, but of thinking that tries to kind of deal with the relationship between the built environment and the natural systems. This lecture, I think, is an interesting corollary to that, and it's very appropriate, I think, to have Lydia at the school at Georgia Tech at this particular moment. So please join me in welcoming Lydia Kallipoliti.
Thank you so much. This was such a great introduction. I'm very thankful for the invitation, and I'll start from the biggest challenge I had in preparing this lecture, which was selecting the music. I never had to think about what music, and I didn't want to pick something that was extremely architectural, like we were talking about the work of Yannis Xenakis, neither something that would be, you know, what I listen to the car, which is usually David Bowie. So I thought of an amazing movie, which, speaking of a kind of migration, a journey between past, present, and future, which is always relevant in my work, in the way that I review, examine information, and the way that I conduct any kind of research project. So the music comes from this film, A Touch of Spices. It is a film which is very personal to me because I come from that area of the world, from Istanbul. I'm from Thessaloniki in Greece, and it's the story of a child that had to migrate from Istanbul, Constantinople, to Greece, and his most precious memories in the store of his grandfather, which you see on the screen, who used to perform canvases of spices and compose them, not just to make food and elements, but also to compose worlds. And this is the child in the movie. He sees a kind of paper as a canvas where spices become elements that don't create necessarily contours and shape, but somehow coagulate in spaces. And you can imagine, let's say, the canvas as something that can be made edible, but also something that he later followed in life to become an astronomer, understanding spices as cosmic dust. This is a kind of image from NASA on space debris that enters the atmosphere, and on this level, this abstraction becomes a kind of image. So cosmic dust, a fluctuating compilation of tiny particles, solid material floating around in space. It's very interesting because it speaks of a formation that crystallizes in several forms: lumps, heaps, aggregations, gyres, swarms, stuff in orbit that coagulate in certain patterns, and they are sometimes without characteristics, but they're certainly not without any characteristics. Although they defy the formats of representation that we use as architects, they have a distinctive character in a way. And I was thinking to start this lecture of showing an older project in tribute of the recent passing of Charles Jencks. What would cosmic dust be when we write architectural history, when we look at information from the past? Probably this map comes very close to it. Mapping visually theories and ideas, trends of times, is what Charles Jencks did in his famous diagram, the evolutionary tree to the year 2000. And it has been largely critiqued. Classifying traditions, movements is a very tricky historiographic subject. However, the documentation of currency in the collective architectural mind, although it is considered at many points a futile project because it only establishes a status quo, it gives us a very powerful visual representation of current conditions. and it is inspirational. This diagram has been reproduced, and if you Google his name, it really comes up along with his cosmic gardens of speculation. So even if every form of representation is unavoidably subject to the desires and obsessions of its author, it offers a concise cosmology of current thought and a reflection of where we stand as where we might go. This diagram was originally presented in 1967 in Jencks' book Architecture 2000, and was then republished in 2000 Architectural Review in this format. And the interesting thing is that it was republished to really validate how prescient he had been in 1967, which is another point of critique. But interestingly enough, he compares the evolution of natural species to the evolution of architectural discourses. And my colleague and mentor, Anthony Vidler, at the Cooper Union, has largely critiqued this essay, this diagram, in 1968 when it was published. Nevertheless, it is a very interesting representation of what happens in a certain historic moment, because unlike this diagram, which is a tree, this diagram, Jencks' diagram, is not a tree. This is Ernst Haeckel's genealogical tree in the 19th century, which really creates a hierarchical system of the world's living stock. He tries to create a system of natural order. But Jencks' diagram doesn't use hierarchy. So it's ahierarchical, and it doesn't have a forking path, a logic of organization which comes bottom down. Instead, it is described as something ahierarchical, of information that, as he suggests in his writing, explaining how he has made this mapping, information is floating, rotating, kissing, and mating. So one point of critique that I had when looking at this diagram is that it favors a generalized pluralism, the coexistence of architectural ideologies as non-discrete elements in a puzzle of large data. Each discrete piece is devoid of social, political, or even functional questions. The world, according to Jencks, was visualized as a collection of ideas, tendencies, and concepts which all simultaneously coexist without friction or battle. The basic, then, problem of pluralism is not the fragmentation of the discipline in 1,000 different directions, but the absence of resistance. Pluralism offers no ideology, no position, no argument, no fight, no ground for a conflict where we can all agree to disagree. Then what is the act of classification? Is it futile in itself? And I think possibly not. And of course, this is the second most downloaded image in the history of the internet. It's one of the first visualizations of network connections in 2003 by the Opti project. And the world as we live it now is now a statistical object, understood as an ever-growing body of big data, as expressed in the rule of thumb that anything that we do is documented, analyzed, and included at some list somewhere. The world is full of events without good or evil, but for which our field and our very existence is philosophically and politically unprepared. As architects, the environments that we produce are not only inhabited spaces, but also platforms that produce data or machines for collective action, deferring iconicity to the internet. This is where clouds of videos, maps, tours, pics, tweets, experiences replace the kind of contextual bottom-down experiences of a visit, of understanding a place as a structure. So in response, I'm going to start, in response to Jencks' diagram and this idea of information and mapping the world, I'm going to show a project that I did with some students a while ago. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago at the Cooper Union, where we tried to redraw, reanalyze, and render obsolete Jencks' diagram, which you see on a screen, and design it as a kind of three-dimensional structure instead of a two-dimensional structure. You see here Jencks' diagram, and this is the notion of time. And the horizontal plane was segmented in 4, let's say, fields: tradition and technology, which is a kind of split division that Rainer Banham used in his stock-taking series in 1960, whether a project belongs or is closer to the humanist tradition of proportions, rhythm, geometry, the understanding and the embedding of the human body into a kind of geometrical cognition of the world, or technology. And this is the kind of move from autonomy to interdependency. Interdependency meaning projects that are not having an autonomous logic necessarily, but respond to certain social, environmental, cultural, and other functional questions of time. So each project was mapped not according to where we wanted to map it, but according to its Googleability, its presence in Google Analytics. These are projects, each cross, the more Googled the project, the bigger the cross. And in 2012, Google Analytics was high-end. Now actually, there's a whole different world, and if we were to redraw this, it would be entirely different. But it's very interesting that what we thought of categories didn't emerge as categories in this diagram. We started by this. We started by understanding the current moment as different categories of thought, related to biological systems, practices differing aesthetic conditions, computation, socially driven projects. We categorize this, but when we deferred the kind of to data, we got this kind of landscape. And what was surprising in working on this documentation was the mixing of projects in overlapping regions. Although we were conceptually documenting the subclouds and the big cloud in categories, as witnessed, we had a fairly clear perception of distinctive categories in their representation. The data retrieved blurred almost seamlessly. So the cloud in general, and the way that we live, the way information blends with our everyday life, necessitates an entirely different way of understanding the world, one that requires us to lose the tether of data as something that can be visualized in its totality. So growing out of Google's model of detecting correlations through applied mathematics and not through context, the way that we understand context, the cloud ranks fractional connections above holistic perceptions of phenomena. What is essential about the cloud is the absorption and collection of data that crystallizes in a region rather than the overall contextual interpretation of the data. So looking back at this project, although we intentionally attempted to resist the survival of the fittest logic of optimization, I think we failed in a number of points to create a pattern that was alien to us to emerge out of the whole soup of all the data that we have collected. My wish was somehow to see the raw vision of code in a shape somehow, not in zeros and ones, but in a new visual language in hordes and piles. It was to see the buried dark part of data, that which cannot be represented via my own meta language of representation, but that which would simply exist as a new nature, independently of whether we had decided it or not, independently of whether we wanted it to be there or not. So concluding with data, this type of disciplinary expansion in the way that we comprehend environments and classify knowledge is similar to a section that has always been very dear to me, and it is this section. It is John McHale, sociologist who used to work with Buckminster Fuller on the design science decade in the 1960s. And this is one section that he drew for the book, The Future of the Future. This was in 1968, but then he expanded that in the ecological context 2 years later. And in that section, it's a vertical cross-section from the core of the Earth to the last phase of the atmosphere, to all the way to the mesosphere, basically. And he called it a survey diagram, a superscale survey diagram of vertical mobility because of our interaction, our understanding of territory and the way that we travel from, submarines, which were, let's say, post-World War II artifacts, and we occupy skies with, it was the space age at that point, our understanding of space has expanded, and this was very, very important to Michael. But the vertical section is significant not simply because it expands our perception of space in terms of scale, but also because it necessitates, like the cloud, a different way of understanding the world, one that asks us to relinquish control in all of that vast scale and to focus deeply in certain regions where meaning crystallizes rather than a total understanding of the section. And if you have a moment that meaning crystallizes, all pieces fall into place. And of course, this was, this is another thing that I drew from an archive. It's by General Dynamics, and it's a diagram by General Dynamics Swiss graphic designer who was called Erich Nietzsche. And he was the first one that drew the section to explain human activity, the kind of breadth of human activity and how it has expanded. So from that, I'm going to something again in how I deal with projects, how I deal with writing. And this is a diagram, an impossible super project of this kind has been for me writing the History of Ecological Design. This is my new book. I've written a concise, small online book for the Oxford English Encyclopedia of Environmental Science, and you can find this online. But instead of just writing in 3 parts, as was recommended to me by the editors of the Encyclopedia, I came to understand that ideas migrate in time and that it was really not very possible to do that. So the 3 parts that I categorize, naturalism, synthetic naturalism, and dark naturalism, as 3 eras of environmental design, I invented all these groups, they're tentative groups, and all of these ideas, like the clouds, overlap. I tried to map them through the lives of these authors, and the landscape was very, very similar to the cloud diagram. The original understanding in the text, and these are the 3 eras, and you see here, this is kind of chronologically closer to 19th century World War II. This is World War II to 1996, and then the kind of Anthropocene. So the first period is tentatively related to what I call the search for roots, as witnessed in the obsessive documentation of plants, trees, and their use of genealogical systems, but also in the experiential long journeys of natural scientists in their belief to be interconnected and immersed in wilderness. So at that point, the idea of wilderness was something outside of urbanity, and the idea of going to the field, to the landscape, to understand an environment and document it and analyze it was the core of all of these kinds of groups of evolution, taxonomy, immersion, and biofunctionalism, early Bauhaus. In the second very broad category, which I call synthetic naturalism, the functions and operations of nature were copied as precise analogs in man-made systems. This transference of life through technological instrumentation has fostered debates on ethics on how architecture could become a functional performative tool for the amelioration of the planet, and transferring the kind of modern, the logic of modernism to performance, from function to performance. And the third era, from what I tentatively call dark naturalism, overlaps with the contentious term of the Anthropocene. Contentious because it is a critique of us geophysically terraforming the planet, but at the same time, anthropos, which is human, is at the core of the naming of that era. And Donna Haraway has recently wrote a very interesting book suggesting the replacement of the term the Anthropocene with the Thulucene, a name for the dynamic, ongoing chthonic forces, underground powers of which people are a part, arguing, I'm a compostist, not a post-humanist. We are all compost, not post-human. And that's a very interesting quote to me, to bring back the kind of materiality, the kind of raw, visceral version that is very much related to the air we breathe. So in that text, I tried, of course, I did the scholarly part of writing, but I also tried to create a kind of hypertext of different terms. So there are links of different terms that have been related to sustainability, which is a banal term that we all critique right now, and different kinds of authors, images, and appendices. So while working on any project that I write about, I'm compelled to pursue different modes of research, and this is what Scott mentioned in the introduction as well. Everything that I do is indivisible: research, practice, teaching. And mostly, I start from an archive combined with technical reports, data management, investigations on alternative formats of representation, and I also produce lexicons, databases, projects, exhibitions, and so forth. So diversity is very critical to my work, not only in the analysis of the content of each project, but also in its forms of dissemination and display. In my most recent project, Closed Worlds, I have been largely motivated to pursue different modes of research, including historical archival surveys, net zero diagrams based on technical reports, producing a book, an exhibition, a series of original drawings, trying to invent a language of environmental representation, an online lexicon, a conference, a virtual reality environment, and a documentary. This is an archivist, Leela Cook-Barber. She was an art historian in the middle of the century, the head of the art history department, and I use her in a way that she classified information, largely having contributed to the invention of the old library system as the representation of my tentative term, history machines, or mediums of immersive scholarship. In many projects, what I'm trying to do is examine, redesign, and reimagine archives. I see archives not as static objects that contain historical documents, but as immersive spaces and living collections where existential ideas about world orders migrate through different architectural and spatial typologies. Each archive is a universe, a kind of cosmic collection like this, but in most cases, the format of representation is a linear type of text in the form of the narration of a book. And in many ways, I'm trying to outsource the material that I document, analyze, and classify into more frameworks of representation, trying to see what the output could potentially be. So this is my most recent book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds. The title of the front page is kind of okay. It refers to the architecture of the well-tempered environment by Rainer Banham, kind of a compendium book that I love and have it as a landmark. The subtitle is kind of ugly. What is the power of shit? And I was, I hesitated to use profanity in the language of my title, but I thought it was a very interesting mix to use this kind of title that refers to Banham to show us that shit is here to bite us back and what it means. What does that mean? That the raw version of materiality, the kind of ramifications of our actions in unintended environments that we create in the Pacific Gyre, in para-economies of e-waste, in all of these unintentional places that are byproducts of the way that we live, work, and consume daily, is here to stay and is here for us as landscapes and environments for us to deal with. And so the raw, visceral version of ecology is something that I was very interested in documented in that book. Now, the format of representation, I mentioned that it was a book, an exhibition, an online lexicon, a website, courses and recently a documentary. I haven't uploaded it yet online, but I will. And you see that the projects range from submarines to spaceships to simulation models for architectural representation, like you saw the Thermoheliodon by Victor Olgier, to countercultural projects in the 60s and 70s, sometimes representing entirely antithetical political ideologies, yet always governed by principles of feedback, of understanding circularity, of idealizing circularity in terms of resources. And I was very interested in how this modality of understanding environmentalism through feedback has persisted throughout the 20th century, even if it has never really worked. In designing the exhibition, and this is how the exhibition looked like in New York, there were so much information. It was an extraordinary challenge to represent it all. And I had worked with the best graphic designers in the world, Pentagram and Natasha Jen, who was unbelievably helpful. There were many different ways in which you could navigate this exhibition. You could see a timeline and pick a leaflet to go to this project. The timeline had production and consumption of resources based on the technical reports. You could read about this project by putting your head inside, and there was this number, and that number correlated with this. Then there were minor histories, which was a mood board of everything that didn't make it into the archive, so parallel histories of closed worlds, because all of the closed worlds documented in the book were realized experiments. I did not include any utopic project in that book. And this was the exhibition in the storefront. And then there was a virtual reality component. I didn't design the virtual reality, but I did collaborate with the person that did the virtual reality environment for each one of the projects to go inside and experience the transformation of resources, the conversion of resources, of input to output. And this is the exhibition migrating from New York to Los Angeles. I brought some other stuff from another exhibition, but it worked very well. Everybody lied there. This is again in Los Angeles, and most recently in Sydney, Australia, where I spent this summer, and the virtual reality experiment. And this is the Minor Histories poster of everything that didn't make it, which has 3 threads of histories. Histories of men, of engineered human figures, which are here in the core. In the white spaces, this is the history of environmental legislation and policy. And these are speculative projects, utopic projects that didn't make it into the archive, but they were very important to understanding the concept of what a closed world was. And I like this picture just because. And this, so from this kind of composite image, there was an offspring of that was to categorize terms in a lexicon. So if you go online, you will find all of these terms that are related, that are coming outside of this archive. And you can go and look at them in a very, very different kind of linear way. So understanding the synthetic landscape and a kind of analytical landscape of this archive would give you different versions of viewing that project. So in terms of the content, as overall as a project, Closed Worlds assembled a genealogy of contained microcosms with the ambition to replicate the Earth in its totality, a series of living experiments that forge a synthetic naturalism where the laws of nature and metabolism are displaced from the domain of wilderness to the domain of cities and buildings. The objective was to cut across different disciplines, including ecosystems biology, communication theory, cybernetics, and design, and redraw the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering by focusing on closed systems and self-reliant environments with case studies ranging from Walt Disney's Epcot in Disneyland to NASA's outer space capsules. So the project was for me a historical cross-section that I have attempted to, through which I attempted to analyze contemporary challenges of the modes of production, recycling, and climate change through architecture of containment and detachment as an inquiry into human spatial and material experience. And of course, the idea of a world in a bottle is nothing new to architects. This is a tiny project by the Viennese experimental group Hausrucker Co. It was exhibited in an art fair in Cologne in 1973. It's called Ein Stück Natur, a piece of nature. And it's very interesting because it represents nature as a fossil. So by the time that this project appears, and it overlaps with the oil crisis of 1973, the idea of wilderness is already contained. It's already a fossil in a jar, something that has died and needs to be contained and recreated artificially in order for it to prolong the idea of the Garden of Eden. Along with that, the idea of the closed world is absolutely present in the reconstruction of idealized microcosms in the history of Utopia. And of course, we think of Buckminster Fuller's Dome over Manhattan project in 1960 that he did with his student at Cornell, Soji Sadao, and Banham's environmental bubble in 1965. These examples are iconic illustrations of a period of environmental anxiety precisely because they manifest our idea that we have lost the untamed land, that we have lost wilderness. Our canonical understanding of utopia is actually very close to the idealization of a closed system, a self-sustaining physical environment demarcated from its surroundings by a boundary that does not allow for the transfer of matter or energy. In the post-war period, however, the idea of utopia reappears through the enactment of whole earth systems. And this is what I showed you before. Nevertheless, today the idealization of containment is no longer explicitly related to material resources like it was maybe in the 1970s, but also related to informational resources, to the closure of data and capital, and to the way that we reconstruct a unique self-referential understanding of the world through the way that we assemble social media collections in our phones every day. But materially, still, closed worlds are no longer poetic metaphors for lost utopias. They have become profitably real. Our indoor environments today are politically charged spaces that reflect social ideals and culturally specific standards of taste and judgment. Confined within artificial enclosures, environmental control has enforced biased standards of life, even though in most cases these standards institutionalize absurd criteria that homogenize ideas of comfort for the entirety of the human race. And this is, of course, Jacques Tati's famous movie Playtime, an architectural must. So through this construction of interiority, closed worlds are also power structures that maintain and manage constancy over bodies and psyches. And I speak throughout the book of indoor atmospheres and the establishment of thermal equilibriums in interior spaces since the 1950s, sequestered comfort zones held within narrow ranges. This is an old one from Carrier Corporation, which reflects an understanding of the body as a tool within a constant atmospheric medium to control and predict its behavior and growth. It is precisely this mechanical vision of biology that gives life specifically a modern character. If organisms, either people or plants, are examined explicitly as mechanical structures serving a physical equilibrium, one cannot account for the complexity, but also not for the beauty of life. So in the book, I argue overall that the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering has been strongly linked to the conceptualization and production of closed systems. As partial reconstructions of the world in time and space, closed systems speak of the transference of life using architecture as the medium and the vessel to secure the cycling of matter, energy, data, and capital. The projects, as I mentioned, documented, represent entirely different political agendas, from military experiments to countercultural practices, from the nostalgia of the homesteading movement to, more recently, the dubious concept of ecological tourism and environmental capitalism. In every sense, all of these projects have been built, they're real, and they manifest the strangeness of the real. They are not experimentally implemented, and they're not based upon speculation. They're real places that help us see that reality is sometimes stranger than fiction. So how do we write? How does one write a nonlinear history like that? Rather than a linear text, in the book, I ventured in examining, redesigning, and reimagining an archive, not as a static object, but as an immersive space and a collection where ideas travel in time from one point to the other, and they service different kinds of agendas, different ideologies, and different spatial and architectural typologies. Contrary to a linear text, a reconfigured archive allows multiplicity, simultaneity, and disruption. It allows the reader to travel between different times, places, and objects of investigation, enabling multiple connections and complex affinities between themes, concepts, and ideas that are not limited to a single place, era, author, or type. A reconfigured archive can produce new interconnected categories out of archival boxes, a universe of multitudes that does not necessarily need to be transcribed in linear time. I see the use of history as a creative and generative medium for contemporary concerns in design, education, and practice, one that does not only promote public engagement with historical material, but also makes evident that in the history of ideas, discourses get recycled. It's not only materials and resources that get recycled in closed worlds. So concepts emerge as allegedly new, though ideas undergo long journeys of migration from one epistemological field to another. Contrary to a building, a drawing, or a book, the archive and the database is a distinctive disciplinary category of an architectural object that empowers new forms of authorship based on the extrusion of evidence to an event that lingers between reality and fiction. And going back to spices and cosmology, an example I like to use to conceptualize time is the history of large-scale galaxies. As far as we know, when we observe a distant galaxy, we see it as it was when time left it, not as it is today. Thus, our understanding of the universe is perplexing and partial at best, since the only thing we have is a form of time machine, one that allows us to see the past only through investigation and observation. Some people doubt whether we can ever know what the universe was like billions of years ago. Actually, the real problem is knowing what it is like now. I find this cosmological metaphor quite empowering because it implies the end of history as a knowledge of the present looking into the past. It offers an alternative reading of architectural history as a reconstructive project of what is selectively illuminated out of an archive of historical objects in order to fabricate multiple versions of present states based on fragments of the past. And so, having mentioned this metaphor, I briefly talked about this project and its different instantiations, and I will mention, and this one too, and I will show you three more, the idea of different formats of presentation and dissemination. And this is another project called Guinea Pigs, which is an offspring of closed worlds. I wrote about this at eFlux and in a book the idea was man augmentation. The archive that I found, which was in General Electric, it was the archive of General Electric, basically. It was the idea to amplify the human body as an experiment. This is particularly a machine called a pediculator, and it was a prototype. It was a robotic animal. Believe it or not, these were funded by DARPA and the Navy in the 50s and 60s. Huge robots that kind of precede Boston Dynamics robots. I found yesterday that Greg Lynn invented another robot that follows you with your stuff along a city so that you don't have to carry it, like a packed mule. So this is an ongoing, let's say, desire to amplify the body, to create robotic mules. And this research was an example. It represented human figures, the idea of the 20th century explorer, which, unlike the 19th century explorer, who was a figure that was a brave body that would go into nature, and it had to be courageous and strong and fit. This body was an amplified body using technology as an idea, where the scientist was willing to become a guinea pig and immerse him or herself into an experiment of sorts. So in many ways, the body became a test bed and a combustion machine, delegating human agency in measurements of input and output. Unlike the naturalist, the guinea pig resisted utopia. It refuted the wholeness of the body, and I'm paraphrasing Donna Haraway here in the Cyborg Manifesto, even the idea of wholeness as a generic idea, and proposed in its place an engineered biotic agency. And these are some of the other examples that I found in the archive. This was the pediculator. This was a patent by NASA. They actually built it. It was called Master and Slave. NASA built a clone, and they would send these robotic astronauts to dangerous areas, and you would be controlled. So the body would be linked through a neural network to this second body that was called the slave. This was another prototype built at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory, again in the late 1960s, which was featured in John McHale's Design Quarterly and other publications, to link the human nervous system to this plugged-in nervous system, this robotic nervous system, as a kind of feedback ecology, directly translating the movements of the master to a series of moves of robotic limbs. And these were some others. So this became a research, a project, part of a book, but it also became an installation at the Istanbul Design Biennial in 2016. This was curated by Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley, and the theme was, "Are We Human?" And all of these figures were presented in a kind of floating thematic from the archive, with a narrative, a manifesto of the subject: the amphibian man, the weightless man, the feedback man, the exoskeletal man, and the excrement man. We also made a hologram, a holographic documentary that people could sit and lose their erect posture and look at this hologram. The idea was that the figures would be floating in the air. We didn't want them to be in a screen, so that you could see the little robotic man floating. And this is another image of that project. And an older project where I've assembled different kinds of formats and media of information was the website EcoRedux, which was also an edited issue of Architectural Design magazine. This was an online platform. It's not there anymore, because I think that it's old. It has become, the graphics have become old, and it shouldn't be online anymore. but the idea was to record a history of a counter history to the canonical environmental discourse in the post-war period, where that featured the planet as a whole ecosystem through the Whole Earth Catalog, and the attempt was to document all of these material experiments that didn't necessarily have a global solution, but they were minor and small and created shelters like the Wobo bottle by John Hebraken in 1965, or different kinds of smaller experiments. This is Martin Pauly in the 1970s, and different kinds of ecological houses. And you could click, this was a synthetic landscape, but there were all these kinds of categorizations from soft experiments to hard experiments. This was a categorization based on material technique. This was a categorization on scale. You could click here and get the full narrative, but there were also audio and videos of this. So all of this material, this was, let's say, categorization. This is the phase change group. This is the assembly group of the experiments based on material technique and so forth. And all of this was categorized linearly, like in a chronological format, but it was also important to create kind of constellations of ideas that were lost from the bed of history. This other project was for the Shenzhen Biennial, and it blended fiction with reality. It's called Autonomy and Autodigestion. And what I tried to do was present an alternative idea of autonomy or different versions of autonomy. We're so prone to thinking autonomy in architectural discourse related to the discipline itself. The Institute of Urban Studies, Peter Eisenman, and of course before that Colin Rowe, Rudolf Wittgauer, kind of the development of a logic that is so explicit to architectural discourse that cannot possibly migrate to other disciplines. Yet the same word and the same logic has been used in other disciplines for the autonomy of energy. There were autonomous houses, autonomy was used in cybernetics and so forth. So I tried to present these other logics, but using the urban landscape and different kinds of understanding urban environments as a platform. And so we imagined 7 different cities: garbage city, island city, microbial city, different kinds of cities that based on a diagram of how digestion, the digestion of resources in an urban environment could be understood in a map. But we tried to spatialize that in a map and document it through a collage of these real parts of the cities in different geographical regions. So the installation was the map surrounded by the real parts of the geography that could exist in let's say, 20 different places in the actual physical world. And in all of the installation, it was like a newspaper rack, and you could pick up and create your own city and write your own manifesto. So this is the last project I will show. It's the archive, not of historical facts, but of something else that I was interested in. It's about air quality and archiving environmental data and air quality. I've always been interested in air quality and mediums of phytoremediation. It began as a bizarre inquiry while I was studying building technology at MIT, and I was in a lab full of mechanical engineers that were studying air filtration, and they were trying to create different kinds of ventilation systems. I've closely documented and drew from them a number of air filtration systems and studied the different types of particulate matter, their size and typology of pollutants in the air. And this is some of these machines that we have tried to document. And the research of the data that we have discovered became part of an installation in Athens at it's an exhibition organized at the Onassis Cultural Center in Athens 2 years ago. And the data that we have collected from sensors there was a narrative. This was a narrative. The narrative was fictional. It was called Airshake, and it examined the character of air pollutants in a future Athens in order to imagine both an array of future diseases and cures. We documented different phenomena of leaching caused by a variety of chemicals that have been released to the atmosphere and their scientific, economic, and social attributes. Airshake projected current urban habits and plausible future urban scenarios extracted from the present based on the impact that different mixtures of air imposed on human bodily systems. And the project imagined an array of diseases that have begun to manifest as a result of the debt crisis and the citizens' denial to yield to the overblown energy taxation. The projection of 4 speculative diseases onto the urban environment took the form of healing environments, and these are the strange things that you see on top of buildings, making visible the linkage between air pollution and the imagined disease. And these are the causes of leaking, the kind of data that we had from the sensor for each type of particulate matter, different kinds of contaminants, whether they were VOCs or they were particulate matter, and their size. And they became a kind of virtual augmented reality installation in space that you could see in iPads coming from these chimneys. And around you could see these kind of speculative environments that would heal the future diseases coming from air pollution. Why was there air pollution in Athens? I mean, there was always air pollution in Athens because of bad policy, but because of the financial crisis, there was a period of time that people were burning their own wood. Sometimes wood was mixed with plastic, and through the furnaces there were extreme quantities of VOCs and particulate matter released in the atmosphere, and that new kind of atmosphere that we call the fourth atmosphere was part of this project and this kind of speculation in these fictional patterns. This was the installation. So I will conclude to ask a question to myself: where's my curiosity in using different mediums of expression stemming from? It is a kind of curiosity, but deeper, I'm committed to writing a history that is enmeshed with architectural discourse and experimentation, not just in writing a cultural history, a history of art and architecture, using art and architecture as the objects of categorization. I'm also interested in placing current theories of design, technology, and the city into an enlarged theoretical, historical, and cultural context. So, to conclude, my effort is to reframe contemporary discussions about ecology by demonstrating the roots of current thought in experimental positions adopted in the context of natural history, environmental science, and popular visual culture in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Drawing a series of historical cross-sections in a global context, my research illustrates how colossal governmental projects involving vast resources of experimentation, prototyping, construction, and communication may be linked to countercultural urban interventions using minimal resources. My broader intention is to place current theories of environmental design and planning into an enlarged theoretical, historical, and cultural context. I'm invested in the relevance of history to vital questions that surface as new in contemporary practice, and in the long-standing change of the architect's identity as a key agent of social policy. I'm interested in examining historically and philosophically the turn of the environmental discourse to the technical dimension, and elaborate on the epistemic conditions under which this turn reflects in contemporary practice. So hopefully my work offers or might offer a counter-history to the canonic environmental discourse of the 20th century, centered on the decryption of the planet as a whole ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Lydia, you'll take questions?
Yeah, if.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a thought that struck me, and you kind of when you were wrapping up your presentation, when you talked about reframing, and this notion of the closed worlds, and essentially where you are creating frames, sort of a succession of frames. And I guess my question to you has to do with how we relate that succession of frames to this greater idea of an ecosystem.
It's a really good question. Frames. Well, I thought about that a lot, not specifically in the way that you termed it, but in understanding the logic of the closed world. When I was writing the book and doing the research, I was very interested in the scientific methodology of excerpting a piece of nature in a petri dish or the laboratory, and the transference from the field to the laboratory in order to understand and analyze a larger system. So I think that it's this kind of scientific methodology is not just about science. It has transferred and related to the construction of our built environments as well, and this was the argument of the book. So the ecosystem is now not something that we try to understand or seek to consolidate in its totality in a larger field that is open, rather in a consolidated, defined perimeter. And this is evident not only in the petri dish, but also in recent projects. This is not for everything, right? This is just my argument for what I wrote about in the book. But I'm quite astonished by the continuous reconstruction of really large greenhouses as spaces of leisure and entertainment, including the Eden Project, the gardens in Singapore, different kinds of indoor environments that that artificially recreate ecosystems, and it's evident through this, and they become more and more people go there, and of course it's very much a parallel history of the construction of hyperreality in malls and the kind of interiority that is a neoliberal 1980s project. But in terms of ecosystems, I think this is becoming more and more relevant and more something that happens in the world. I'm not supporting it, I'm just documenting it. And I think that we really have lost this touch, and that the ecosystem is something that is the representation of this kind of framing of the petri dish. So I don't know if that answers your question fully, but this is the way that I have thought of the idea of framing in terms of ecosystems in undertaking this project, and the way that I'm trying to analyze it in the latest projects of the book. Thank you.
I'm still thinking about that.
Can I ask another question?
Well, I mean, like, how do you not have the frames, though? I mean, how can you generate knowledge without having the frames, even if they are reductive? Right? I mean, how do you know what comes out of the?
That's an even better comment.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, how would you think about that?
The kind of the segue to my next question would have been like a part two to the
Yeah.
initial question, which is in this idea of the framing of nature, the framing of an idea of an ecosystem, because all of a sudden an ecosystem is no longer something that is outside of us. It becomes something that we actually encapsulate.
Right.
And so it's what is interesting in your presentation is how we are constantly transforming the nature of nature in our framing. And the same thing about ecosystems. You know, the notion of an ecosystem is something that exists greater than us and that we are a part of, is essentially different from this notion of an ecosystem that we define in our framing. So it's quite fascinating. I really enjoy that.
I enjoy your comments too. It's, are you an architectural historian or?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
a PhD student.
You're a PhD student?
Yes.
No, it's they're excellent questions. There's no answer. I think that it's the methodology of excerpting, the scientific methodology of excerpting is absolutely necessary, because the more complex a system becomes, the more it became important for the natural scientists to excerpt a piece and study the piece to deduct conclusions for a larger context. It's just that right now, what I'm critiquing in the book is that this closure is generating new types of environments inside. And I think that's extraordinarily important to witness, analyze, and know how to handle. Just like, for example, in the 1970s, the second cybernetics order that was spearheaded by two Chilean biologists, Maturana and Varela, they were arguing that for cybernetic systems, living autoPSs and self-organization. But this is actually happening right now in built environments, because there's an extreme tendency related to, construction trends, the kind of combination of leisure and entertainment in a constructed piece of nature, like in Singapore or Eden, to create these kinds of spaces, and the agenda of sustainability supports that, so it becomes a kind of market force as well. It's something new in that sense, that we're generating this closure is not just a petri dish to deduct conclusions for something else, it's a new thing. and that is the new kind of ecosystem that we have to start looking. And of course, with that comes a responsibility to design more open systems, buildings that are more in sync with their environment. And that's a kind of inherent conclusion of the book, because I have talked to several practices, like big offices, like I have friends that are partners at Foster, and when they listen to the closed world lecture, this is not the closed world lecture, but they were saying that, we can't, buildings are closed because it's too complicated with the communication between all the sensors to have operable windows all the time. So they're designing them in this way. And that has profound implications to the way that we construct our building environments. So it's a complex question, and I don't even know if I'm framing it as precisely as I would like to, but it's, I think, important to see the generation of the new natures that we construct. Yes?
One of my favorite phrases you used was dark naturalism.
Dark naturalism.
That set off light bulbs in my head, but I'd like to hear you elaborate.
It's not my term. It's Timothy Morton's term. If you know this writer, he's a philosopher. He's a professor at Rice, and he wrote of dark naturalism and of hyperobjects. He coins these terms. There is this viewpoint. I don't necessarily agree with it. Paolo Antonelli, for example, exhibition in Milan Triennale very recently was on dark naturalism, even though it was not coined as such, claiming that we have already reached the end of the world, and now this exhibition shows, that was the curatorial mission statement of the exhibition, we're trying to represent our death. and this is a very cynical viewpoint, but it is related to, let's say, the absence, the idea that the idea of nature no longer exists, and nature is only, the new natures are what we have constructed as byproducts of our daily activities, which are all of these unintentional environmental conditions like the Pacific Gyre and para-economies and so forth. It's a little dark, and I'm not siding with that, but it is an important philosophical trend in environmental thinking, environmental thought, and there are a lot of writers that support the kind of position of Timothy Morton, including Jane Bennett, is one. She writes on vibrant ecology. Donna Haraway wrote a new book, and there is a call to action to think in a different way, not just to think in terms of eco-efficiency and performance, but to understand different kind of philosophical concepts for our times. Okay.
One more question, anybody?
Could you maybe talk about the implications of inhabiting information? I found that to be an interesting idea. To be, I suppose, immersed in an idea and thought.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know how to precisely answer this question. It was, when I think it's my longing, like what I'm trying to do through the work, overall. When somebody was in the exhibition, he mentioned that this is great because it's not just information handed to you, but it's inhabited because you're in it. And maybe that was a kind of spatial experience because it's very hard to design an architectural exhibition that has a lot of material because people are extremely bored. Their attention span is about 2 minutes. They visit something and then they leave the space. So how to create different temporal journeys for different types of visitors, people that want to stay for 1 minute, people that want to stay for 4, 10, or 2 hours is something very interesting to me. And you know, the kind of virtual environment was one way. The archive that you could pick a leaflet and go home and like study later was another way. Putting your head inside was another way. So I'm trying in many ways to understand formats of representation of what I find. But the idea is that as a scholar, as a historian, and I come from a history theory background with my PhD, and your obligation when you examine an archive is to translate it into a text, which is one interpretation of the whole thing. And this is how history has been written canonically. And all of that these other narratives, the byproducts, the little parentheses, all of the icons and images, all of the stuff that was not included in that narrative is completely vanished, or it doesn't offer a quicker version to a visitor rather than just take a book and read it from A to Z. And I'm interested in how we can create knowledge in different formats because the attention span of people, architects are very distracted readers. They never read full books. I can't remember the last time that I read a full book. And I know that, I mean, you can raise your hand, but I only have time to read like a chapter and this and that to write a paper. And the attention span of people because of social media and news is just diminishing so significantly. So the way that we understand and inhabit the world is very different through bits and pieces that we collect and assemble, right? So how to create tentacles to that way of understanding the world through constructions of knowledge spheres is extremely important, as it is to investigate the material in terms of context. And I think that's what it means to me. But how to put that into words literally and how to do that is another question that I think needs many more years of effort and resolution. But that's the intention, to create different ways of seeing material that applies to different kinds of audiences, so to expand your audience. Yes?
Thank you so much for presenting today. This is really, really fascinating. I have a two-part question. I'm going to make it really quick.
Okay.
Out of all the exhibits that you created, which one was your favorite, and how do you think your audiences responded to it and received it? And also, what's next for you after this? Thank you.
I like the, I mean, I don't know if that even matters. It doesn't matter what I like. And I don't ask myself that question. I don't ask myself who's my favorite architect or what's my favorite project or so forth. But I can definitely say that the closed worlds was the one that I put most of myself in. And I think it was such a struggle, both in the book and to work with Natasha on how to sort out different itineraries of ideas and pieces of stuff that needed to be there, and there were so many that that was the challenge, and finding different mediums like the timeline, the leaflet, the VR, the technical report, the new drawings was definitely my favorite and a very enjoyable exercise for quite a long time. And right now I'm working on 2 new projects, the History of Ecological Design, which is, I showed you very briefly. I'm making that into a book. It's an online document. It's about 65 pages right now, so it's a short online book, but I'm turning that into a book. I'm working on the history of biocontainment, biohazards, and containment also of populations and species, and related also to immigrations and borders, but also biological material. So these are but they're in their infancy, these 2 projects.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you so much.